Hello, and welcome to Season 6 of Looking at Lyme. We're thrilled to be kicking off this season talking with contributors of an important new research report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which studied current gaps in research and treatments for Lyme infection-associated chronic illnesses. Today, I am joined by the president of CanLyme, Janet Sperling, and together we speak with Kester, MD, and Nicole Malachowski, Colonel, U.S. Air Force, retired. Their new publication is called Charting a Path Toward Treatments for Lyme Infection-Associated Chronic Illness. We spoke with these two about their experiences putting together this report and what impact they hope it will have moving forward. Nicole Malachowski is a retired Air Force fighter pilot, National Women's Hall of Famer, keynote speaker, and tick-borne illness patient advocate. She lives and works in Colorado, and she represents the patient perspective on the NASEM committee that produced this important new research. Kester, MD, board certified in both internal medicine and infectious diseases, is the chair of the publication committee and the vice chair of the National Academy of Medicine Forum on Microbial Threats. During his 24-year career in the U.S. Army, Kent led multiple research platforms at the biggest and most diverse lab with the Department of Defense, with a significant emphasis on emerging infectious diseases, and later led that institution as its commander. Janet, what is this report telling you?
I'd like to define what the National Academies of Science are in the United States. So they're the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. This is a group of people who have been elected. So they're chosen for being absolutely top-notch scientists. And they're chosen by other scientists as being really good people. And these are people, they're independent, objective, they're doing their best to give very objective advice, and they're willing to put issues under the microscope. So they're willing to take issues that can sometimes be very challenging. And of course, we all know that Lyme disease, especially late Lyme disease, is a really challenging disease to deal with. So it's very prestigious and it's very responsible. And it's in effect a place for sober second thought. So to me, what this report is saying, the most important message is that Lyme disease in its later forms, and they're going to call it Lyme-Iacke, but we can call it late Lyme, we can call it chronic Lyme, we can call it a number of things. This is a very real disease. We can identify it, and we can actually get to work solving the problems. And this is something that we've been missing for a long time. So I think it's really important in Canada in particular. We've spent a long time with some of the doctors referring to Lyme disease as a myth, or sometimes they say it's junk science, or they say it's pseudoscience. But this report is really a breath of fresh air because it really is driving home the fact that we do have the tools that we need to actually start solving the problems.
Why is this report so important in Canada?
The challenge in Canada has been trying to include the patient voice. And so we've had a lot of false starts in the past. We've really wasted a lot of time, and I'm going to say decades, ignoring these very real problems that patients are faced with. And that is to get the diagnosis and then to get really effective treatment. So the big change when we look at this NASEM report is that you can see the voice of the patient representative. So this is Nicole Malachowski, and she's done a brilliant job. The committee is taking her opinion really seriously. So you can see her influence throughout the report. And it was not just this usual thing that we're kind of used to, pat the patient on the head and then, send them off and then go behind closed doors and do what you were going to do anyways. This report really having taken into account the patient representative has to be taken seriously. And every researcher worth their salt is going to want to integrate the main messages of this report into their next grant proposal.
Let's welcome our guests. Nicole, how did you get involved in the Lyme community?
Like most people that are probably listening to this podcast, I was recruited into this community by a tick bite. Around 2012, I was serving in the United States Air Force. I was stationed on the East Coast in North Carolina. During the summer, fell down with just a ton of nondescript kind of flu-like symptoms. I was told at the time that we don't have Lyme disease in North Carolina. And unfortunately, that was the day that this odyssey started. And so I've been living with Lyme infection-associated chronic illness for 13 years now.
That's an experience that a lot of people have experienced.
The lack of education and awareness is something that causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. I can speak, in terms of my case, from the time that I presented to my military doctors with a rash to the time of my accurate diagnosis at Massachusetts General Hospital was actually 1,525 days, more than 25 doctors across 8 specialties, and 3 misdiagnoses. I know that my story is repeated countless times around the world. And so I considered it an honor to try to represent the patient perspective, on this committee.
And Kent, can you tell us a bit about how you became involved?
I'm an infectious disease clinician. I also chair the National Academy of Medicine's Forum on Microbial Threats, which is a longstanding convened activity that looks at all sorts of emerging infectious diseases, whether it's related to research or even touching a bit on policy. In 2023, we did a workshop that was looking at sort of chronic illnesses associated with infectious disease. Now, it was not focused on Lyme per se, but it was on a lot of things. As we've seen now, people really believe that like long COVID, it's a real thing. What we saw is the amazing and very interesting number of commonalities. Not the same, but whether it's fatigue or brain fog or other sorts of things. When this consensus report concept came up, I was asked, well, we already did this workshop. Would you be interested in participating in this? And I thought, well, absolutely, because this is clearly an area that has been, in many ways, for reasons that we all understand and some that perhaps we don't understand, has been kind of a backwater. For years, people with chronic symptoms of whatever sort, presumably related to a Lyme infection, whether treated or untreated, have been sort of disregarded. These people, they're just malingering, or it's all in their head. And we see now that there are a number of these infectious diseases that can cause, whether it's time limited or much longer, more chronic symptoms. To me, it seemed like a great opportunity. As an aside, when I was an infectious disease fellow, so subspecialty training in the U.S. military, my first patient in clinic was a patient with what we know now of Gulf War syndrome. And of course, at the time, this was also thought to be just not a real thing. And so having had that background where I had patients, I knew there was something wrong with them. I didn't know what it was, and nor did anyone else. But we see that these patterns repeat themselves. This is an opportunity to really kind of dig into the topic and help support the development of a report that can potentially influence the field in research to hopefully get better treatments for these patients.
I am really appreciative because, I've been involved for about 20 years now. And the same story as Nicole, that my son got Lyme disease and they said, well, we don't have Lyme disease in Alberta. He can't have Lyme disease. And I said, but I don't think he even got it in Alberta. You hear these things and you think, well, the starting bias when it comes to Lyme is appalling. And I can tell you in 1980s, I was taking medical entomology, and it's the first time I was introduced to this. And I got top marks on the exam because it was very simple. There was one tick, there was one bacterium, and the tick transferred the bacterium to the human. And unfortunately, 20 years later, when my own son got Lyme disease, I realized it's far more complicated. Certainly what I took out of the report when I first looked at this was this idea that you really are trying to bridge this gulf. People keep shouting at each other. We're losing the science because the science is the tool that gets us to where we need to go. But right now, people are using the science as kind of a weapon, a way to bludgeon somebody. And you say, no, we're all talking about the same thing, and let's focus on the patients. So in any case, I'm very appreciative of the report.
Janet, I kind of wanted to build on something that you just said. We talk about why do some of these patients have persistent symptoms after diagnosis or after the traditional, standard of care. And one of the things I've been asked about this report as the patient representative is, well, we, the patient community, we know that people remain ill after the illness. Like, why is this new and why is this different? And one, I agree, right? We've known some of people like you, Janet, have been living with this for decades, 20, 30, 40, years, or you've known someone or cared about someone who does. So yes, we as a community know this is true. It's really only been recently, right, in the last decade that we've seen the Centers for Disease Control come on board. They do often use the research term of post-treatment Lyme disease, syndrome. Why I think this report is important and why I think it is different is exactly what you said. This is an independent, objective, cross-functional group of people that came together from totally different backgrounds, not just representing the CDC or NIH or just representing patients. This independent, objective advice, collective advice to inform policy. And I think as an American, and certainly as a patient myself, the thing that I think is great about NASEM is they are congressionally chartered, right, to serve as the collective scientific voice of the United States of America. That is a big deal. It is a big deal to see NASEM do this report and acknowledge that Lyme IACI is real. That is a huge step in the right direction.
Your comment about, well, there's no Lyme in Alberta. I think we all realize the epidemiology of Lyme is, shall we say, imperfect because it's not something that's as reportable. In some places, not reportable at all. There's really no prospective assessment. Whether you want to invoke climate change or just the natural spread of vectors, the ticks are moving. All these factors to kind of have a dogmatic view that there's no Lyme in Alberta. Things are changing. The idea that there's no other hypothesis, there's no other explanation for things, we have to be more scientific than that and be open to these ideas. We might be wrong on occasion. That's fine. We have to have an open mind.
Nicole, can you just speak to IACI? What does it stand for?
IACI, IACI, stands for Infection-Associated Chronic Illness. As you know, in our community as patients, a lot of times we talk about chronic symptoms. We will use the term chronic Lyme scientifically, and I'll let Kent, of course, add on to this as the scientist here. We don't know the actual causal mechanism of these persistent symptoms. And so oftentimes, while patients are using one term, as Janet mentioned, we're talking past each other when a scientist or a researcher is looking at that term chronic in a different way. And so Lyme infection-associated chronic illness is keeping that, I think, aperture open for whatever is causing these persistent symptoms. And as importantly, as you'll note in this report, this new term IACI is now being utilized across the scientific community to talk about those things, as Kent mentioned, that are similar, things like long COVID, things like fibromyalgia, things like ME/CFS. By us getting on board underneath a common term, we're going to see a lot more, I think, coordination, collaboration, and efficiency.
As Nicole mentioned, there are a variety of terms out there. Some have been developed specifically to serve research programs or research grants. Others have just sort of come about and they lack specificity. And so the recommendations that our committee gave is to develop a consensus definition. And so we use this term IACI. It sounds kind of funny, but maybe people remember it. To recognize that certain terms that exist now, you probably missed people. We want to make sure that a resultant definition, developing that definition was not within our remit, but nonetheless, we call for it, something that the policymakers and the research leaders can then take that to heart. If a good definition ultimately can be developed, I think this will serve the community much better. I'm not sure what chronic Lyme is. And you could probably ask 10 different people and you get 10 different answers. And some of it will be included under this rubric of IACI. Some might be just, we don't know what it is. It's just chronic Lyme. In trying to sort of dig into this a bit more and really sort of charge the research policymakers to really take this as a priority. Because if you can't define something, how do you then develop solutions? That's kind of one of the views that we took on this committee, because our job was not to write the textbook of Lyme-associated complications or chronic illness. That was not our remit. Our job was to sort of look at the field and try to identify those key areas that we saw as lacking, that need work, so that it could then enable that meaningful research responding to the patient needs, ultimately, not just interesting science, but patient needs as a fulcrum to make things go forward.
I'll add here too that one of the things I liked about this is you're saying it's this huge and complicated, messy landscape, but there are subtypes. So right now, I think what happened in the past is we ended up with, one person was looking at it. It's sort of like the blind man and the elephant, that people were looking at it from different perspectives. And you're saying, no, let's bring this all back. Let's take a look at the overall pattern. And now we can start saying these are the sort of subtypes that we can start talking about. And then we can start coming up with really, as you said, effective and efficient ways to treat it once we've developed the little tiny subtypes that we're looking at.
Whether it's artificial intelligence or molecular medicine, with the application of a lot of these newer tools, you can find patterns that no one ever knew existed before. Looking across the broad expanse of chronic illnesses associated with a variety of infectious diseases, when you see that and see researchers, and they're still kind of working in silos, well, this is my disease. Well, this is my disease. Well, guess what? Okay, all you guys are here together. Did you ever think that what you're seeing in this viral illness is very similar to what we're seeing in Lyme or something else? One of the points that we really tried to make clear is that we do need to enter the modern age, use these newer tools, get the funders to get on board to really foster that work, because on the one hand, we want patients to be better. We want their quality of life to be better. They want a treatment. But on the other hand, we also do want to understand what's going on, because with that understanding comes the opportunity of additional interventions. These can be done in parallel, but to leverage these modern tools that are continue to advance almost on a daily basis.
I find it irritating when people start focusing on the Lyme. It's not the Lyme, it's the patient. It's the effect on the patient that matters. Sometimes you can get lost in the idea doctors don't treat diseases, doctors treat patients. And I do think that doctors want patients to get better, but they're getting frustrated. And that's why we're kind of chasing our tail.
As someone who served on this committee as a patient for the last year, I hope it comes across very distinctly in this report that patients are the center of this. One of the things that our patient community knows is that interaction between researchers and academics with the patient community can definitely be improved. One of the things we highlight is the importance of patient involvement when developing patient-reported outcomes, right? What is actually important to the patient and what counts as positive improvement from the patient perspective. I think the other thing that is highlighted in this report is just the need for science to reach out in coordination, and let's really start mining these patient registries. Let's really start mining and utilizing these patient biobanks in a way that bridges, the gap that still really does exist between the scientific community and our patient community.
I think you're speaking to the importance of having those resources for the medical field as well as for the patients. My understanding of Lyme is I don't know very much about it. It can't be that. I'm going to diagnose something else. They just don't have the ability to access the information. I'm thinking that's close-minded of a certain aspect of the medical field. I'm going to be right rather than I wonder what that's about.
And hopefully this committee's report is saying just that. Let's not just be curious, but let's also be courageous.
There's a concept in medicine called Occam's razor, which suggests the simplest explanation is the truth. And in many cases, that's probably true. When there's sort of years of just kind of a dogma or semi-dogma of there's nothing wrong with these people. Clinicians hear this, and they can't find an answer. And so, well, you got brain fog, maybe you need to get more sleep. Do some exercise, and we've all heard this sort of stuff. Clinicians want their patients to get better, and they get frustrated because these very symptom-based approaches that don't take into account some of the larger issues don't work in many cases, and that's a problem. The other point demonstrating the centrality of patients, there is a great example where the patient community really helped to catalyze change, and that's in HIV/AIDS. We saw this. I was in medical school where an HIV patient, we were wearing moon suits around because no one knew what it was all about. And then fast forward a number of years, their methods were a bit, in your face, but it made a difference. There are different approaches for different diseases and different situations. What it points out to is, regardless of the disease, the patient perspective is incredibly important, especially when there's frustration, when there's a perceived or real lack of forward movement and patients are feeling like they're being disregarded. It's all in their head. And that's wrong.
I'll say for the patients, they often say, I don't care about my swollen knee. Like, I'm really sorry I have a swollen knee, but I need my brain back. And that if they had one thing they want back, they want their brain back. So maybe they have to walk with a cane. That's okay. And I think that's where some of the problem is. They're saying, but Lyme disease is the sore knee. I can cure your sore knee. And they're saying, okay, stop talking about my knee. It's my head I want to talk about.
You're really hitting the nail on the head, Janet, and we talked about this a lot on the committee. What is important to patients? When you look at any of these registries, you talk to any of the nonprofits such as yours, we know it's all comes down to fatigue, musculoskeletal pain, right? And then obviously the cognitive, executive cognitive dysfunction that we all have. The real question is, what's important to a patient? One of the things that I've been asked since this report has come out is, well, why are we focusing on treatments instead of cures? And I want to be very, very clear. One, our charge was to look at the current state of treatments and try to, chart a path forward. But the fact of the matter is that we need to be doing these things in parallel. We know for the last 40 years that a lot of amazing research is being done trying to find the causal mechanism. We haven't found it yet. In parallel, we have people whose quality of life is suffering. And so why can't we look at both at the same time? By no means are we saying let's all just focus on treatments at the cost of a cause or cure. We want both of these things to happen. We need to be able to give patients something to alleviate that day-to-day suffering that's important to them. And as importantly, don't we want to afford treatments options for these clinicians who care so deeply, who do want to see their patients get better or alleviate some of that suffering, return them to a quality of life that's worth living? I can only speak for myself here, but I get on my best days about 3 to 4 hours a day. So for example, today I started my day at a doctor's appointment, as many in our community do. I went quickly to the grocery store, and now I am on this podcast with you. That's it. That's what I get to do today. If we could discover a treatment, so fatigue is the number one thing for me. If we could discover a treatment that could give me just 1 or 2 more hours a day, honestly, I would be thrilled. I would be unstoppable. The amount of things that I could accomplish. And this is why we need to center the patient in these patient-reported outcomes in a way that we find treatments that are scientifically vetted, that are safe and effective to help both patients and the clinicians. As soon as this report came out, I sent it to all of the 24 doctors that I had seen during my time. I think this is about utilizing this report for education and awareness. A lot of times we think this is such a large problem, and I don't know what I can do to really solve this problem. I tell the patient community, don't worry about solving the problem. It's a ripple in the pond. If each and every one of us can just educate one person, one clinician, if we could talk to just maybe one philanthropic donor and get them on board and say, look, NASEM, right? The collective scientific opinion of the United States of America is saying this is a big deal, then we can start moving the needle.
One thing that I always found difficult is when we're talking about patient advocates, some of the block we got is people were saying, you can't be a researcher and an advocate at the same time. It's like, what? No, of course you can. And there are a lot of people who have Lyme disease who are highly educated. And they're really kind of taken aback. They're saying, I'm not used to people talking to me like that. And so that's some of the other thing that we need to say, that you can be a patient, you can be a researcher, you can see the importance of the research. Like I would say, keep the data. What do you mean we've had 40 years? We know some things work, some things don't. Keep the data. We have the computers now to try to look for patterns in all this data. So, the tools are there. So, let's start tomorrow. Let's not talk about this anymore. Let's say, okay, we've got a place to go. Let's move forward.
Couldn't agree with you more. And Kent touched on this briefly, and I think you just brought it home. We are on the precipice of some extraordinary technology, right? When we look at what artificial intelligence and machine learning can do for this space, my mind is really just blown. It's very hard for me to even get my arms around it. And I can also say, based on a lot of the guest speakers we had over this year, there are a lot of extraordinary researchers who are interested in that very thing. So now if we can get policymakers and decision makers to see the importance of that, we can match funding with will, and we can match funding with intelligence, and we can ensure that science will bridge this gap.
That's the key point here, is to highlight these gaps, whether it's in policy or research strategy, or as we talked about before, definitions, and to highlight those as areas that are deserving of sort of higher order assessment and implementation, whatever those things may be. If we rewind a couple of years during the COVID time, and let's say that what we know now is long COVID, let's say the numbers were much less. it would be a blip on the radar screen. Again, my guess is we'd have similar ideas. Well, these people are okay. But what we saw was because of the large numbers of COVID patients. Please, I'm not trying to say long COVID equals the chronic illness associated with Lyme, but they are analogous in certain ways. But the fact is that we had so many. It's a real thing, and this is accepted as a real thing. And in fact, real money has been put against this. And so the hope is to leverage that experience and highlighting these are patients. They deserve better. We can try to bring this to a better place, whether it's all the things we talked about, better definitions, better research policy, focusing on the patient with particular respect to treatments that get people feeling better.
I'll point out, I have always hated the term post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, because what it is post-inadequately treated Lyme disease, because they're still sick, right? So it doesn't matter why they're sick, they're still sick. And I think that's where this Lyme IACI, just trying to say, we know about long COVID, we know about Lyme IACI, we'll call it. We're say it's Lyme IACI, we know it's real. So let's get to work, get the job done.
And to your point about that term post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, we do talk about that in the committee report. It's important to note that that was a very specifically defined for research purposes only. It was very narrowly defined for a very specific type of research. In a great way, it was a step forward, but it's very narrowly defined. It was meant for specific research. And so this Lyme IACI term is a lot more inclusive of everything we're talking about here. And I talked as a patient, about this idea that just sharing this report with, one other person, one other clinician, sharing this report with your elected representatives, so that when the opportunity provides itself for policy or funding, whatever that looks like in Canada or the United States, they're going to have the information they need to seize that opportunity at the right time and place to move this forward.
Your report touches on the importance of biobanks in Lyme research. Can you both speak to that topic a bit, about biobanks?
Biobanks are really important in medical research. Typically, it can involve a variety of things. It can be a repository of data that results from biological samples and assessments. It can be like a freezer farm full of biological samples, serum, tissue, and can also be a repository of samples that are collected as part of clinical trials. Drugs, vaccines, when done well, where there is a good understanding of the biobank or biobanks that are available, how well characterized the samples are, under what conditions they were collected, and in what context, et cetera, can really be an important tool to help us learn more. Biobanks are used throughout infectious disease, throughout oncology, different types of tumors where cells are collected and other things, and are used as a resource for the community, the research community, to learn more about the effect of potential interventions. These are powerful tools. Nicole probably has a better sense of this, but in the community, certainly in the Lyme community, there are a number of these biobanks. If I'm some professor at a university and I have a little research project, so my biobank might be 2 shelves and a freezer. That's my biobank. Someone else might have a couple freezers full of thousands of samples. But how do you marry these up so people know what's out there? Because right now it's kind of siloed. And so to be able to understand across the field, or perhaps to consolidate biobanks, which is done all the time in cooperative infectious disease and oncology studies, where these biobanks are intentionally consolidated. So you know what you've got, and it becomes a much larger resource for the community.
When we were talking about biobanks, I know myself personally, a lot of my body is part of several different biobanks. And so I think when this report talks about efficiencies and collaborations, I think that that's really important. Right now, we're still missing that, collaboration between the patient samples that are being given graciously, right, and with great dignity, and how are they being utilized by that scientific community. There's still a little bit of a gap. As the patient advocate on this committee, I took that responsibility very, very seriously, and I tried to make sure that when I spoke, I was speaking responsibly. One of the things I think a lot of the researchers who came and spoke to us didn't really understand was how willing we are to help. Look, if you've got a biobank request, you let us know. Talk to CanLyme, talk to nonprofits. We will get you what you need. It was hard for me to kind of express how much I believe that our patient community is willing and ready to step up with biobank samples when we actually are in a nice collaboration and involved in this entire process. It's one thing to say, well, thank you for your sample. It's another thing to say, hey, this is our idea. Here's what we want to look into. What do you think of that hypothesis? Are you interested? Would you be able to help us get the patient community behind the specific samples we need? Oh, by the way, throughout our research, how about we keep you updated on how your samples are helping us? And when we get to the end of this and we have our conclusions, how do we involve you? It's not just a transactional experience, that it becomes patient-centered from start to finish.
Well, it's transformational in terms of engagement. It's genuine engagement with the patient.
We had an unfortunate example here in Canada where the patients gave their samples. The researchers said, we're going to look in the blood. And I said early on, yeah, but blood is the wrong tissue. Like the first thing Lyme disease says is, I'm getting out of the blood. And I said, so any conclusion you're going to make based on, PCRing a bunch of blood is going to be highly suspect. Like, I really think it's the wrong thing. So I think that's, again, something that there has to be a little better back and forth, that a lot of times people are saying, oh, I've got the money, I'll do this, I'll sequence the heck out of anything. But they're not thinking that with Lyme disease, you have to get the right tissue. You can't just go around, sequencing anything and expecting a reasonable result.
Part of the most impactful research, especially in infectious disease, oncology, would be the two areas that I would think about. Some of the most impactful research, especially to lay the groundwork for developing interventions or diagnostics, has been to query well-established, well-curated biobanks. And perhaps some of those also have associated data, that you have to marry up as well. We all know that sometimes in research, scientists know what will get funded. And that's okay. I mean, that's life. That's life in the fast lane. But the reality is, by using these resources in a responsible manner and to be able to sort of generate hypotheses that takes into account what's available and, importantly, what comes next. Is this just get me a paper that I get published so it helps me, get promoted in academic medicine? Or is there a real strategy of what comes next? And that's, I think, an area that we sort of touch on throughout the report. I don't think, it's not so explicit, but I think the point is, in the end, this is what undergirds the whole concept of the field that I work in, which is translational medicine. In other words, it's not just doing interesting science, but it's like, what is the goal? And in this case, it's developing interventions that help people. It's not just making a widget. It's not just having a great paper somewhere and then I go on and do something else. It's actually helping people. So it's that is that goal of translational research.
When we're talking about these kind of patient-driven, biobanks maybe, or patient-driven registries, as we went through this year, what kind of stood out to me, and I know we touch on this in the report, was that from the patient biobank or patient registry perspective, they're like, we have all this data, we have all these people, it's untapped, it's underutilized, it's been undermined, and we're just waiting for that collaboration. And on the flip side, we would talk as a committee to these amazing researchers and scientists. They were like, those exist? We didn't know that was available. So hopefully at a very basic level, this committee report can be like, hey, right, there is an opportunity to collaborate more deeply in an area that has been undertapped.
Can you think of something that we haven't asked you that you wish we would have asked you?
How do we get from point A to point B? How does this report ultimately get operationalized? And of course, we recognize that a lot of the work that's been done, as Nicole knows all too well, a lot of the work that's been done thus far has been done outside of some of the standard funding, as we think, the kind of the biomedical funding industry, like in the government, NIH. I mean, there's been some funding, of course, but a lot has been done by the nonprofits who are really trying to address the needs of the community. So I guess the question is, again, probably rhetorical, is how do we get from point A to point B? How does this get operationalized? I don't know the answer. An important first step, of course, is the actual report, which is, it's big. But I think by being able to get it in front of key people to sort of gain their interest so they understand the importance of this, I think that's an important step along the way. Ultimately, as you know, this is a process. I hate to say it, but it is a process to, both to gain sort of allies and advocacy, and then to channel that so that it actually then merges into policy and impact. I'd be lying if I said I knew how all those dots would get connected, but I think this is an important step along the way.
And one of the things that NASEM is doing in this NASEM committee is exactly this, right? These outreach moments. We're delighted to be able, Kent and I and our other committee members are staying busy. We're delighted to be able to speak to advocacy groups, nonprofits. We're also speaking to a lot of players in the federal government. NASEM themselves also reaches out to American elected representatives. And so this is being communicated in a very strategic way.
As far as operationalizing this, I took a course back in 2009 about how to take science and then turn it into policy. So I was talking with all these people and they said, I listened to your problem, Janet, and I say, your problem is you need the hearts and minds of people who can actually put this into motion. And that really kind of stuck with me because I think that's what we're looking at. But we finally got to a point where I think we have a really good team. And I think if we're all working together and we are all agreeing that we really are trying to help the patient, then that I think, we're at that point. We're ready to move forward.
I agree. I want to underscore there's still a lot of hard work to be done.
Many celebrations along the way, but knowing we still have work to do. Well, I would like to thank both of you. You've been very engaging. I think that our listeners are going to be in a better place after listening to this podcast. I'd just like to thank both of you for being here very much.
We really appreciate the opportunity to get the word out. Lots to do, and a big part of it is getting the word out. So thanks very much.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for your interest, and thanks for everything you're doing in Canada for our community.
Thank you to our guests, Kent Kester and Nicole Malachowski, and also to Janet Sperling for joining us. Remember, carry your tick removal kit and stay safe in the outdoors.